Ever feel like the global economy is like one of those amusement park rides? You know, the ones that start all slow and gentle,
Hmm.
and then suddenly you're getting whipped around,
Yeah.
and all you can do is hold on tight.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's kind of what it feels like right now with all these economic headlines and market swings.
That really does.
And one minute things seem sort of okay, and the next, there's a trade war brewing or a stock market crash looming.
Right.
It's a lot to keep up with.
It is.
That's where the deep dive comes in, right?
Yeah.
We take these complex topics, all the knots and tangles of the global economy,
Yeah.
and try to untangle them just a bit. So today we're diving deep into something that's been making waves lately: import heffingen, or
Yeah.
tariffs as they're more commonly known. The U.S. has been implementing these, and it's often framed as part of Trump's trade policy.
Right.
We're going to be looking at some really interesting analysis from commentators on the Telegraph channel. So our mission today is to figure out why these heffingen are happening, what kind of impact they could have, and what it all means for the bigger picture of global trade.
Okay.
Luckily, we have an expert with us today who specializes in financial geography and global economics.
Oh, thank you.
Now, the news has been all doom and gloom about Trump's so-called crazy plan leading us into recession.
Yeah.
But you see things a little differently, right?
I do.
What jumped out at you about last week, and why is this moment so important?
The key thing to grasp, I think, is this isn't some kind of new strategy that Trump just pulled out of a hat.
Right.
He's been talking about tariffs for decades, literally like 40 years. This has been a consistent theme in his thinking.
Right.
You can actually find old interviews of him making pretty much the same arguments he's making now.
Yeah.
And it's crucial to remember that he already imposed substantial tariffs on goods from China back in 2018.
Right.
And then Biden came in and just kept those tariffs in place. So these recent heffingen, which now target most of the U.S.'s main trading partners, well, it's not really out of left field.
Right. It's tempting to think that before all this, we were living in some kind of free trade utopia.
Yeah.
The commentators we're looking at, they actually called April 2nd Liberation Day, which really says a lot about their take on this whole situation.
Absolutely. And that idea that there were no barriers before these heffingen came along is just not true.
Right.
Tariffs and various trade obstacles, they've always been part of the game. Take the EU, for example. They've been using things like product standards and GMO restrictions for ages to protect their agriculture.
Right.
So these kinds of financial mechanisms to support domestic industries, they're nothing new. They've been around in one form or another for a long time.
You mentioned this global trade order that Trump's challenging. It's been around for, what, about 30 years? What were the conditions that allowed it to emerge in the first place?
The historical context is really fascinating here. So this trend of lowering tariffs and increasing global capital flows, what we often call globalization, it really gained momentum after the Cold War ended. But its roots go back even further to the post-World War II period. The U.S. was the undisputed economic powerhouse back then, accounting for something like 40 to 45% of global GDP and even more of global purchasing power, maybe 50%.
Oh, wow.
Europe was in ruins, and the U.S. was deeply worried about communism spreading. So they decided to help Europe recover economically.
Right.
And a major way they did this was by giving European producers really privileged access to the enormous American consumer market. They basically lowered tariffs on European goods.
So the U.S. was kind of like the consumer of last resort because there weren't other markets that could compare back then.
Exactly. China's economy was nowhere near its current level. It was still behind the Iron Curtain, Africa, and most of Asia weren't big consumer markets either.
Yeah.
So the U.S. was the prime destination for exports. And all this was happening while the U.S. was also footing the bill for European security. But fast forward a few decades, and the global economic landscape has totally transformed. China's become a major player. So has Japan and the EU, with Germany leading the industrial charge, has become extremely wealthy.
Right.
Today, the U.S. makes up about 25% of global GDP and maybe 30 to 35% of global consumption.
Still a lot, but less than it was.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yet the U.S. is still carrying a massive burden for global security. And there's this imbalance in market access. For instance, tariffs on cars are lower in the U.S. than in the EU.
Right.
This is the unfairness that Trump started harping on about around 2017, 2018. So what's crucial for listeners to understand is that the global trade order we've been accustomed to for the past few decades, it wasn't some organic development. It was a deliberate construction that resulted from a very specific set of historical circumstances.
Right.
American dominance in the Cold War. And that foundation, well, has shifted significantly.
Now, you said you identify as left-wing, which might surprise some people given our discussion today.
Yeah.
But the commentators in our source, they actually touch on a possible unexpected overlap between some left-wing critiques of global trade and what Trump's doing now.
It is interesting, isn't it?
Can you talk about that a bit?
Well, it's interesting to remember the anti-globalization protests of the late 90s and early 2000s, the WTO demonstrations, Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine.
Yeah.
From a left-wing perspective, the trade order that solidified in the late 70s and 80s was often seen as fundamentally unjust, especially for the so-called global South, Africa parts of Asia, Latin America.
All right.
The narrative was all about extraction and exploitation, multinational corporations from richer countries profiting at the expense of developing nations. You think of things like labor conditions in Nike factories or cobalt mining in Africa. Some economists on the left, they even tried to calculate the financial losses the global South suffered because of this trade order, and it's estimated to be in the trillions of dollars annually.
Trillions.
Yeah.
So some on the left should theoretically be cheering Trump on for disrupting this system?
That's the unexpected connection. Trump's rhetoric about the system being unfair, it does resonate with some of these left-wing critiques,
Right.
but the intended beneficiaries are different. The left focused on the exploitation of the global South, while Trump's main concern is the decline of American industry. Things like mining, steel production, car manufacturing.
Right.
These have largely moved to places like Europe and China. His goal is to bring those manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. So while there's the shared sentiment that the old order wasn't fair, who benefits from changing it, that's where the two perspectives diverge.
The source material also mentions the COVID-19 pandemic as a factor here.
Yes.
It really exposed the vulnerabilities of relying on global supply chains.
Absolutely.
And then you have Scott Bessent, former Treasury official, arguing that this is a national security issue and that a financial crisis is looming.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
This is a really crucial point. The pandemic was a wake-up call. It showed us just how fragile it is to rely on these far-flung global supply chains for essential goods. And Bessent, along with others like Elon Musk, they've raised serious concerns about the sustainability of the U.S. financial system, pointing to the massive government spending and the mounting debt.
Right.
Bessent even suggested that the U.S. could be headed for a financial calamity?
Financial calamity.
Yeah. His argument is that reshaping trade relationships along with shrinking the federal bureaucracy is a necessary course correction. It's similar in a way to Russia's shock therapy in the 90s, a drastic measure, but maybe unavoidable when you're staring down the barrel of potential bankruptcy.
So essentially he's saying the American empire, with all its global commitments, is costing too much and not delivering enough.
Exactly. That's the argument.
So cutting costs, particularly in defense spending, that's part of this bigger strategy.
Absolutely. Trump has even floated the idea of mutual defense budget cuts with Putin and Xi.
Wow.
And the constant pressure on NATO allies to increase their defense spending that fits into this picture, too.
Right.
This desire for allies to take on more of the financial burden of maintaining global security.
It's all connected.
It is. It's important to understand that the trade system and the security system, they're deeply intertwined. Safe shipping lanes, satellite infrastructure, all of these things come at a huge cost, and the U.S. has largely been bearing it. The aim now is to get allies to chip in more while also trying to revitalize the U.S. economy.
What kind of pushback are we expecting from U.S. trading partners? And what are some of the potential outcomes, challenges of these Heffigan?
The immediate reaction we're seeing is companies in Europe and Asia rethinking where they manufacture their products. The report from Le Monde about Volkswagen potentially expanding production in the U.S. is a perfect example. Bessent emphasizes that it's more important to watch what businesses actually do rather than just listening to government rhetoric.
Actions speak louder than words.
Exactly. There will definitely be short-term disruptions and uncertainty as negotiations play out. But the long-term expectation is that companies with existing operations in the U.S. will expand them to serve the American market directly.
Makes sense.
That way they can sidestep the import Heffigan.
Avoid those tariffs.
Exactly. And we've seen reports of many governments expressing interest in striking bilateral trade deals with the U.S. But a report by Stephen Mirren, who's now chair of the Economic Advisory Council, he stresses that this is a complex transition with significant risks, a narrow path to navigate successfully.
A narrow path.
Yeah, retraining workers who might lose their jobs, building new manufacturing plants. These are all challenges. And there's also the question of Biden's attempts to create green tech jobs. Some argue those efforts have mainly benefited the defense industry, not really created the intended impact.
Right. And then there's the whole AI question looming over all of this.
Right. The rise of AI could totally reshape the future of work, potentially displacing white-collar jobs, just like automation impacted blue-collar jobs in the past.
Hmm.
This could actually make a revitalized industrial base even more critical,
Interesting.
focusing on skills like repair and specialized craftsmanship.
Because those are harder to automate.
Exactly. It's a very uncertain future, and there are real psychological consequences for those who might be displaced by AI. It's a big shift from the advice previously given to blue-collar workers to get college degrees and head for the tech hubs.
Right.
The focus seems to be shifting towards Main Street after decades of prioritizing Wall Street. And let's be honest, the pre-Trump global trade order wasn't exactly paradise for those without advanced degrees.
Right.
There's a strong sense among many blue-collar voters that they had nothing to lose by supporting Trump. That anecdote about the blue-collar worker's son on Twitter, it really captures that feeling of desperation, but also hope for change, even though a lot of mainstream commentators were predicting negative outcomes like a higher cost of living.
Let's talk about that potential for a higher cost of living.
Okay.
The second part of our source features Besson discussing inflation and how currency dynamics might play out with these heffing and...
Right.
What did you find interesting there?
What struck me was Besson's emphasis on economic indicators beyond just the stock market, things like falling oil prices and lower interest rates.
Right.
He argues these have a much more direct and significant impact on the average American worker.
Makes sense.
The initial assumption might be that tariffs automatically mean higher prices for consumers. But a study that looked at the 2018 tariffs on Chinese goods actually found a tiny price increase, only about 0.7% over 4 years.
Wow. That's way less than people might expect.
Right, and this was largely due to changes in exchange rates. The dollar strengthened and the Chinese renminbi weakened, which essentially absorbed a good chunk of the tariff cost and shifted some of the burden onto Chinese consumers. Of course, the impact of these broader global heffing in on inflation is still up in the air, but lower oil prices could help to offset some of those effects.
Right.
And lower interest rates are beneficial for the U.S. because they reduce the costs of servicing its huge national debt.
Especially with all those short-term bonds that need refinancing.
Exactly. France, for example, is struggling with rising debt service costs.
Stephen Myron's report also suggests using these tariffs as leverage in geopolitical negotiations.
Yes. Myron argues that these tariffs could be a way to encourage other countries to align with the U.S.'s security interests. He's suggesting offering them preferential access to that massive 30–35% of global consumption we talked about, but in exchange for certain conditions.
Quid pro quo.
Exactly. These conditions could include things like more favorable exchange rates for U.S. businesses, or even getting central banks to convert their holdings of U.S. debt into very long-term or perpetual bonds at low interest rates. This is what's called financial repression.
Financial repression.
Yeah. Essentially, governments using measures to reduce the real value of debt, which often comes at the expense of savers.
Interesting.
This obviously raises the question of whether this is a form of coercion and how much leverage Europe really has in these negotiations, given its economic ties to the U.S.
Right.
But Besson seems pretty confident that the U.S. would win a trade war with China, citing the existing trade surplus. He points to the strength of what's often called the American empire, its military bases around the world, the U.S. dollar's role as the primary global reserve currency, and its control over critical infrastructure, like undersea cables and international payment systems.
Right.
All of that gives the U.S. a lot of bargaining power.
It does.
Slapping on these tariffs is probably a deliberate shock to the system, a way to force everyone to the negotiating table.
This makes me wonder if a country like the Netherlands, if it weren't part of the EU, could it have negotiated a better deal, a more favorable bilateral trade agreement with the U.S.?
I'm not sure the EU has much negotiating power in this situation. Key member states like Germany, which have a lot at stake economically with the U.S., they're likely conducting their own less public negotiations behind the scenes. Germany, for example, has historically benefited from its goods being relatively cheap within the Eurozone, which boosted its auto exports to the U.S.
Right.
In the long run, the U.S. might be aiming for a weaker dollar, which would make American-made goods more competitive globally. We've seen this kind of thing before with the 1985 Plaza Accord, where Major trading partners were pressured to revalue their currencies against the dollar. Maybe we'll see something similar, a Mar-a-Lago Accord, in the future.
A Mar-a-Lago Accord.
I like that. The result might be a bunch of bilateral deals tailored to specific national interests rather than a broad multilateral agreement.
Makes sense.
For Europeans, a weaker dollar would mean cheaper trips to the U.S., but it could hurt their exports to the U.S. market.
Right.
The reaction in places like Wolfsburg, where Volkswagen is headquartered, to the idea of shifting production to the U.S., it shows this concern. And the competitiveness of the U.S. auto industry, especially as we transition to electric vehicles, that's another factor that's constantly changing.
So zooming out, what are the broader geopolitical implications of all this for the U.S., China, Europe, the BRICS nations?
The EU's deep economic ties to the U.S., they likely limit its options for a strong response. They might end up making more symbolic gestures than concrete policy changes. Russia's already been pushed closer to China and the BRICS nations. China, meanwhile, is gradually decreasing its holdings of U.S. dollar reserves, building up its own independent industries, and actively looking for alternative markets for its goods. What the BRICS nations will do and how unified they'll remain, that's a bit of a wild card. Besant's rather cynical comments about Europe's energy dependence on Russia and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline incident. They reveal a rather dismissive attitude from some in the U.S. And the Trump administration's communication style in general, it often clashes with traditional diplomatic norms, which contributes to the negative press they get.
Right.
It's a bit like the controversy surrounding Dijsselbloem's comments to Southern European leaders. There's a perception of strategic incompetence and reckless opportunism among some European leaders. Kissinger's famous question about who to call in Europe, it still feels relevant. The Financial Times headline about a divided Europe's reaction to the U.S. heffing, it highlights this lack of a unified response. Different EU countries are reacting in different ways, with some being more cautious than others. And the lack of real action behind the tough talk, it's becoming more and more obvious.
Yeah.
In the Netherlands, the dominant reaction seems to be negative. A lot of people see Trump's actions as just crazy. This might be partly because there aren't that many diverse economic perspectives in Dutch academia and media. They tend to be dominated by market economists, unlike in the U.S., where you have a wider range of economic thought, including political economists who focus specifically on power imbalances and inequality in economic relationships.
Okay.
It's crucial to remember that economies aren't just abstract markets. They're shaped by political decisions and power dynamics.
Yeah.
It all circles back to our earlier point about tariffs and political influence having always been part of the game.
You mentioned your left-wing perspective earlier. How does that inform your view of all this?
Well, from my point of view, there's no inherent reason why we should always prioritize American consumers on a global scale. I think there's a strong case to be made for curbing the power of the U.S. financial sector, which has become enormous and arguably unsustainable.
Right.
According to Marin's report, part of Trump's strategy is to redistribute economic power within the U.S., shrinking the financial sector and boosting the industrial base. Now, the American retirement system depends heavily on financial assets.
Right, 401ks and all that.
Exactly, but there's a real danger when finance-driven decisions start to negatively impact essential industries.
We've seen that with Boeing.
Exactly. Besant estimates that these heffing could puck in a lot of money for the U.S. government, potentially $300 to $600 billion annually.
Wow, that's a significant chunk of change. Yeah.
It is. The timeline for the U.S. to see positive outcomes depends on whether the heffing mainly lead to minimal price hikes for consumers, which would limit revenue, or whether they actually generate substantial government revenue. It's important to remember that the EU also collects import duties. One report suggested that the long-term increase in tax revenue for the U.S. could be huge, maybe $3.1 trillion over 10 years, which would dwarf any potential cost increases for households.
Trillions.
Yeah. They even mentioned the possibility of lower income tax rates in the U.S. down the line. But it's all still very uncertain because of the ongoing negotiations and the various demands the U.S. might make beyond just tariffs, things like increased defense spending from allies, stricter intellectual property rights agreements on currency manipulation, changes to immigration policies. In the end, tariffs are a tool to force negotiations on a much wider range of issues.
It definitely feels like we're living through interesting times, as the saying goes.
Yeah.
But for the average person in the Netherlands listening to this, the big question is, how will all of this affect them?
That's the key question, isn't it? People in the Netherlands have already felt the impact of global events on their lives. Think about energy prices, the sanctions against Russia, the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage.
Right.
We should expect these shifts in global trade to have long-term consequences for the Dutch economy.
Mhm.
One area we haven't really explored, but that's very relevant to the Netherlands, is tax avoidance.
Oh, yes.
The Netherlands plays a big role in helping large U.S. corporations avoid taxes through its various legal structures.
Right.
This is bound to be a major point of contention in future talks between The Hague and Washington.
Yeah.
While the average Dutch citizen might not directly notice this in their daily spending, it will definitely impact the tax advisory sector and potentially government revenue.
Mm.
But here's an interesting thought. There might be an unexpected positive side effect.
What's that?
Less pressure on the crazy housing market in Amsterdam if fewer wealthy individuals are taking advantage of Dutch tax loopholes.
So Donald Trump might accidentally help solve the Dutch housing crisis.
It's a possibility.
That's certainly a thought-provoking angle. I appreciate you sharing your insights, especially coming from a left-wing perspective. It offers a different way of understanding these events. And given your concerns about climate change and the environment, it's interesting to consider one potential unintended consequence of these moves towards shorter global supply chains.
Sure.
Less international shipping and air freight, which could actually be good for the environment.
Yeah.
It's ironic that environmental groups aren't exactly aligned with Trump's policies, even though there might be this environmental benefit. Maybe Franz Timmermans should be Trump's best friend.
Maybe.
Well, thank you again for joining us today, and safe travels on your commute tonight. And best of luck with your lecture on international financial centers in this new post-hyperglobalization world.
Thanks for having me.
It feels like the global landscape is changing so fast, and understanding these underlying forces is more crucial than ever.
It really is.
And that's why we do the deep dive.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time.